where that, and that's where, that idea of, I guess, sort of unsettling us in terms of short stories or flash prose kind of came to, and that's how the collection came together. But maybe to further our conversation, sort of knowing what kind of writing you each like to do. I know that with a number of you, but maybe we're all working on things that we don't know about as well. And knowing if you're working on something now or if you're wanting to start something new, then we could have a fuller conversation perhaps, if that works for people. So in my upper left-hand corner, I have Tori. Tori, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. So I'm Tori Grant Wellhouse. I'm from Green Bay. And I write poetry and fiction. And I like to explore magical realism and the ghostly. So I'm hoping I can kind of bridge the two worlds with what I learned tonight.
Then Janice, I've got you up next.
Yeah. Well, I haven't done a workshop for quite a while, so I'm pretty excited about this. I haven't been feeling well, and it's a long story, but I write poetry and creative nonfiction, and I've written quite a few columns for my newspaper. I live in Woodstock, Illinois, but I am legitimate. I always have to say that. I grew up in Wisconsin. I went to the university. I have a house in the in the Rhinelander area. I'm a WFOP member, so I always have to kind of state my qualifications so you don't think some interloper just sneaked in here. The latest thing I took a workshop, I think during COVID, I don't know, in the winter sometime on poetry that looks like something, and so I wrote a poem about my feet moving down the page, and I kind of like that. And I just wrote a found poem based on an article on Time magazine, and that's the first time I even knew what a found poem was. And I don't know, how good it is, but I was kind of stepping out of my usual writing. But what I've written for the newspaper is a lot of stuff about COVID and how I would like to have a new normal rather than the old normal. So that's what I do. And and I live in a small town. I guess but we're, we have a train, so people commute from here to Chicago.
Gotcha. Jeannie, I've got you next.
I am Jeannie Moscow. I live in Middleton. I've written a lot of poetry, but I started I don't know, earlier this year, I guess I actually had an idea for a story. So I've been working on my story, and I tell people it's kind of like Alice in Narnia with a little bit of a magic ring thrown in. So it's kind of a magic story. And so that's sort of why I wanted to come to see, if I can have any ideas about, how to proceed, how to make it interesting, since I have not ever, I've written short things, but not ever a story, because I never had an idea. So now I have an idea.
Gotcha. Macy?
I'm Macy Washoe. I'm in Lac du Flambeau. I just write poetry and for personal enjoyment. And I just enjoy taking these Zoom classes where I can learn things and maybe participate in places where if I had to actually come there physically, I wouldn't be able to travel that far. So.
I have to say, I've loved the access we've had with, not having to drive places and getting to see people and do things that, when I get home from work, I'm putting on the stretchy pants. I'm not going out. It's been nice to have access to things that I wouldn't have probably taken advantage of otherwise. That's been one nice learning thing during this time, is having greater access to things. Andrea, I've got you next in my grid.
Hi, I'm just a recreational writer, I guess, and I haven't been able to go to workshops, and I saw this and thought it'd be fun to join it.
Well, thank you for coming. Sandy?
Well, I write mostly speculative poetry, and I've been thinking a lot about melding genres and how a speculative poem often combines something from one genre with something from another. So in the last poem that I wrote, Baba Yaga mates her chicken hut with a TARDIS, and so that she can, travel across time and space. But I'm still examining how that works. How you can throw things together that aren't expected to go together, to create surprise or a new way of thinking about something.
And Sandy, do you ever write prose poems, or are they always lineated?
I write prose poems sometimes.
Gotcha.
Most of them are although mostly in the last few years I've been writing, shapes and forms.
Gotcha. Oh, yes, I remember some of those. Marjorie?
I'm Marjorie Pagel from Franklin, Wisconsin, which is near Hales Corners. I'm taking a flash nonfiction class from Christy Craig. She's a Wisconsin writer, and I'm also been involved with Kim Sir of Red Oak and Peggy Rosga, who teaches out at UW Wisconsin. And I took the liberty of inviting a friend of mine from the Christy Craig's workshop. Kathy, you'll see her down there. She'll tell you about herself. But anyway, I'm interested in the idea of blending the different genres and just hearing whatever you have to say, Christina.
Well, thanks for coming. And then Kathleen, is that you that Marjorie mentioned?
Yes, I used to live in Wisconsin, so that means I can be here. I live in Las Vegas, Nevada, and have for the past 40 years now, but I lived in Chippewa Falls, and Marjorie and I are kindred spirits, and we met through Christy Craig, and I'm just happy to be here. I think you're all very interesting, and I'm writing notes, so thank you.
Well, glad you could come. And then Randy, I'm hoping you can hear us now.
I don't know what was wrong, but it's all working now. So Randy Scannell from Green Bay. I write poetry and fiction.
Gotcha. Well, good. I'm glad we got everything working now. So I'm going to talk about, I guess when I think about the kind of work I've been trying to do, I call it, I suppose, a little horror adjacent as opposed to horror. And so I'm sort of focusing more on the idea of writing unsettling things or the uncanny as opposed to horror. And so that's kind of what I'm focusing on a little bit tonight, is the idea of how to write things that will kind of unsettle, that will sort of linger in the reader's mind, as opposed to sort of what we think of sort of genre-wise as horror. And so that's kind of what I'm focusing on. And I've got slides put together because that's what we're doing. So unfortunately we won't see all of our faces when I turn to that. But sort of thinking about maybe what are some of the underlying theories that we can use to kind of maybe pinpoint, if we want to do that, how we might think perhaps intellectually about what are the ideas that underlie how we might do that, what are a few techniques we can do in terms of our writing, you know, thinking about sort of perspective and point of view, or the kind of imagery we might want to do, and some things to kind of turn to that we could look at in our own writing, how we want to do that. And some of them are kind of translations from other genres. So that might kind of work for some people in terms of what you're talking about. And some of them are visual techniques. So I've tried to kind of think about, if we know what this looks like in this other form, how might we move that into prose in terms of how we would do that in language. And then we can sort of have a moment to think about, okay, thinking individually about our own work, do we have questions about how could we do that? Or we could have a conversation about that. And then maybe ending with some prompts, some ideas that we could kind of move away from this with. Here's an idea to try. Here's an idea to try. And I've got one that's, you know, sort of more focused on the idea of story, of narrative. I've got one that I think would work well for either flash prose or prose poetry. I tried to kind of design them so that they might work depending on kind of where we're moving in terms of that. If we're more sort of poetry focused towards the lyric, or if we're more sort of focused on narrative, I tried to build a few different prompts. So if that works for people, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and we can kind of talk through that. We won't see all of our wonderful faces for that, but I just want to encourage people to, you know, stop and we can have a conversation at any point. We can also pop questions into the chat, and Tori and I will keep an eye on the chat, and we can stop and have a conversation at any point if that works for people. Sound like a plan? Okay. So I hope, whoops, I'm on the wrong, sorry, hold on, I gotta get on the right. Forgive me, I should have been perfectly prepared. Okay. So, shoot, it went right back there again. Hold on, my bad. I'm gonna close this second one. There we go. All right, can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So I wanted to first kind of define and maybe sort of give some elements of what I mean by the uncanny. When I'm talking about the uncanny, I'm starting kind of with, you know, the idea of Freud's The Uncanny. And then sort of I noted at the bottom, if you want to kind of look up the specifics of sort of the theoretical, what we're talking about. Again, I'm talking about the uncanny because I don't want to talk about sort of what's merely kind of frightening. I think that when people sort of think of horror, or they think of horror as a genre, often they kind of jump to the idea of, you know, jump scares and things like that. And I think that's really hard to do in writing because we end up just kind of perhaps defaulting to pacing, you know, that things have to just move really quickly. And then sometimes it just ends up being, you know, if we do it in terms of our sentence structure, we just, you know, have things like popping up or jumping up all the time. And we just get sort of the jump scare, or we just have like sentence structures that are really sort of short and declarative, and it kind of moves around really quickly. So I wanted to move away from that, which is kind of sort of merely frightening, and think instead about creating things that'll kind of linger in a reader's mind. And so if we think about the uncanny in that way, we're thinking of more that which is sort of intellectually frightening or psychologically frightening, as opposed to that which is merely sort of, you know, quick or violent. And when I think about what I'm drawn to, or what truly lingers with me in a way that's threatening or frightening to me, I think about sort of the slow burn, or that which lingers, as opposed to that which sort of like jumps off the page and scares me. And that might just be my aesthetic and my taste. That might not be what you're thinking about, but for me, that's the uncanny, as opposed to, you know, that which, you know, makes me like leap in my seat and spill my popcorn and soda. And so when I think about, you know, trying to capture that on the page, I'm thinking about some of these things on the slide as opposed to gore, as opposed to violence, you know, as opposed to those sort of jump scare moments. And so I've tried to kind of outline some of those things. And I think there's probably some crossovers here with other genres a little bit as well. So that which we experience on the page as unsettling because it's strangely familiar, but again, it might be sort of out of place. That for me unsettles and has a slower burn. Therefore, you can kind of revisit it at certain moments in a text, or it pops up and recurs in certain moments in a text. And each time it recurs, it kind of adds to its unsettling nature. So things that recur, you know, you can use repetition in a way that's really interesting and becomes more unsettling each time it recurs. Something that's realistic in an unrealistic setting, or something unrealistic in a realistic setting, also has that sort of uncanniness to it, that sort of slow burn unsettlingness to it. And it's not going to jump off a page in the same way and seem as unbelievable to a reader when it occurs. So it won't sort of create this veil necessarily between the text and the reader in the same way. Also, the creation of maybe an event that's sort of eerie or taboo in a particular context, or perhaps the whole context is sort of strange, but the event isn't necessarily. It's like a mismatch between contexts can create this kind of unsettling moment. And then also, again, repetition or a doubling or a doppelganger moment can kind of, you know, create this overall just uncanny unsettlingness. The classic example is the way in which, and I obviously this is an overdone one, but I think it kind of proves the point, is the way in which certain kinds of dolls are unsettling because they're both realistic and non-realistic at the same moment, right? So like, you know, Raggedy Ann dolls aren't, I'm guessing we all know what a Raggedy Ann doll looks like. That's not necessarily unsettling the way a more realistic doll is unsettling, right? Because it's both artificial and real. So I think that's a good example of the uncanny. I'm actually in my writing room right now, which is where I put all the things that creep my partner out. And I have like my weird little paper mache dolls and things like that I find at antiques malls, because we go antiquing a lot. And this is the room where I have to put everything that creeps him out because it's not allowed in the rest of the house. And I think you know it when you see the thing that is unsettling, and it's because it's both realistic enough, but there's something just slightly off about it in its context. That's what makes it kind of uncanny. It's just slightly off in context. If it were more unrealistic, you know, we wouldn't be unsettled by it, but it's just real enough and slightly off, and it depends on the context it's in. If it were in a doll shop, it wouldn't be weird. It's that it's in a different context that it's weird. So that's kind of that sort of notion of the uncanny that I'm going for. The other underlying theory that I find really useful in terms of this, what is unsettling about that which is unsettling, is this notion of categorical impurity. And I have to say that when I found this idea, for me, this went to the heart of why things that freak me out. Because again, it's not, for me, it's not gore, it's not, you know, violence. That might scare me in the moment, but it doesn't sit with me and creep me out. This is the stuff that creeps me out. So Noel Carroll, I have to say, I think this is the best book title I've ever read, Philosophy of Horror or Paradoxes of the Heart. That's like just the most brilliant book title ever. He says that categorical impurity is essential to horror. And that's that whatever is the thing that freaks us out, right? Whatever is the monstrous thing, whatever you want to call it, right? In some cases, in horror it's a monster, but in some cases it's not a monster, it's a thing. But whatever that thing is, the reason that it unsettles us is that it exists between states. It cannot be easily classified. And in that it cannot be sorted and classified by us, it's cognitively threatening. So if we think of like classic examples of like monster movies, right? The zombie or the vampire, right? They're neither alive nor dead, right? They're neither man nor monster. We can't sort them easily. And because we can't sort them, they're cognitively and intellectually threatening to us. And so we cannot set them aside because we cannot understand them. That's why so many of these things that frighten us, right? Are they alive? Are they dead? Are they human? Are they non-human? They're cognitively threatening to us. And so if we're exploring what is unsettling, finding a way for it to be unsortable, unclassifiable to us, is the thing that will unsettle us the most and allow it to linger. So again, it may well be my aesthetic, but I don't like to traffic in a lot of gore. I don't like to traffic in a lot of, real violence. That's not something that I enjoy writing. And quite frankly, that's not something I enjoy reading. But that which sort of psychologically, I just can't sort and figure out, that's the thing that it'll keep me thinking. It'll keep me engaged, and I won't be able to resolve it. And that inability for me to resolve it, it's interesting to me. It's interesting for me as a writer, and it's interesting for me as a reader. And it enables me to engage in some of these ideas, which I think are interesting, but without kind of, again, hammering the blood and the gore, or really subjecting either my readers or my characters to the kind of violence that I'm really not interested in engaging with. Does that idea make sense to people? Am I the only person who finds it interesting?
No, I think it's very interesting and very unsettling.
It really is, isn't it?
Yes.
Because we want to resolve things. We want to have an answer. I think that's why sometimes horror movies that wrap everything up too much are the ones that I'm like, that's not scary anymore. I'm interested in the idea of unresolvable things.
I think impure is an interesting way to put it.
Yeah.
I'm kind of wrestling with that a little bit, I think.
Well, and I think too, if we think of sort of like some classic horror and slasher, I think there are things we used to think of as impurity that we've kind of aged out a little bit culturally. And I think that's interesting too. I think there are ways in which some of the classic horror movies used to wrestle with certain things in terms of gender and sexuality that we've kind of aged out of, and I think that's a good thing. But yeah, it's kind of that monster that we're not sure is human or not, and can never be human and can never be dead, right? That's kind of an enduring idea. That what do we do with this monstrous thing that will never be resolved is really kind of an enduring idea. It exists outside of our understanding of our humanity, and therefore we don't know how to resolve it or our interactions with it.
Does there come some blaming of either the reader or the writer of this type of story or whatever, of blaming, why can't I figure this out? What is there about this thing, this impurity, this whatever? why can't I figure this out?
Well, I mean, I think that all of these ideas are rooted in a certain kind, they're rooted in cultural ideologies, right? So in terms of them, we have to sort of think about what are the cultural ideologies that they're rooted in, which sends us down a whole nother level of theorizing and thinking about. So it has to be, I suppose, complex enough that it can't be solved easily.
I think you're talking about things that we can't control. Once we can control them, you know, put them in a box and, you know, on the shelf, and even if they're creepy, you know, we've got control over it. You know, it doesn't linger. We know what it is. You know, my husband's ashes in his vase on the mantle aren't creepy. I have control over that. But, you know, if we were lived in a culture where his ghost was coming back at the door, even though I loved him, that would be creepy because I couldn't control that.
Well, and I'm thinking like, I mean, zombie movies are still quite a thing, right? And the whole zombie figure. I'm thinking of like the funny movie about zombies, Shaun of the Dead. I don't know if anybody's seen that, but at the end, one of the characters decides to keep his mother, right? Because he loved his mother. And so, you know, you're not supposed to keep a zombie, right? You're supposed to kill the zombie. But he decides, but she's my mother. I loved her, right? But I can't just let her be a zombie because then she would infect and harm others, right? So he keeps her chained up so she can be near him because he can't kill his mother, right?
That's his best friend.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you're right. The best friend. Yeah. He doesn't want it. He loves he loves him. He can't
play video games with him.
Right. So he tries to come up with a solution because again, you can't solve the problem of the person you loved who's turned, who's not the person you loved anymore. And that person can't be resolved because they're not a person. Like that's a comic zombie movie. But again, it's still got this idea that the person is not a person. The person's become a non-person who will only cause pain, but they were once a person you loved, right? Like that's the sort of unsolvable thing. That person is categorically impure. They're now a zombie. There's no resolution.
Your endings are kind of cliffhangers then?
Well, not necessarily, but they're unresolvable, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you think of the first zombie movie, right, Romero's, I mean, it's the child who eats their mother, right? Yeah. Sorry, this is all getting dark, but I'm just saying they're like unresolvable, you know? So I think if we want something that's truly unsettling, there has to be something unresolvable. Is it okay if I move on?
Mm-hmm.
So I think if we turn to our own writing and think about how do we do some of this, I got sort of three things to talk about. One is tone, the other is imagery, and then the other is this idea of translating the idea of the eye camera in terms of perspective and point of view. So this is Mary Poppins, and we know Mary Poppins. We love Mary Poppins, right? Yay. But the thing is that just a slight switch in tone, I think, can kind of unsettle. And so you've probably seen these sorts of things where people take what are lovely childhood movies and just kind of switch the tone a little bit, and they suddenly become unsettling and horrific. So hopefully this will work.
Is to go about it in a proper fashion. I should put an advertisement in the Times. Select the next person. No references, I presume. May I see them?
I make it a point never to give references. They're not here, dear.
What? Where else would they be?
Well, they're missing.
17 Cherry Tree Lane. It's a matter of some urgency. What is the meaning of this outrage? Will you be good enough?
So if you, I mean, you can watch SpongeBob SquarePants, you know, bits turned into horror movies. You can see Frozen turned into a horror trailer. You can see anything turned into a horror trailer. But I guess the question is, what are the slight changes in tone we can make that just take something that ordinarily would be, right, like a neutral narrative or even a happy narrative, and just kind of make it unsettling, right? So this is obviously from a different genre, but what are the slight changes they made that just turn it on its head, right, that switch it?
Well, the music for one thing, and then the facial expressions and the lighting.
So what are our tools that would be analogous to that, I guess would be the question.
The dialogue, I suppose.
Okay.
Well, how we describe the scene.
Okay. Yeah. So you know, just slight changes in our word choice, right? Could and just maybe some well-planted, well-timed word choices, you know, probably quite early on in the story, right? Or quite early on in the flash piece, or quite early on in the prose poem, could just slightly, right, unsettle. And they might be subtle enough. I mean, obviously that one wasn't subtle, but they might be subtle enough that they could just kind of plant the seeds for some uneasiness on the part of the reader, that could let them know, you know, that to watch for a coming detail, or just sort of get them off kilter enough, right, to know that the overall sort of tone of what's coming would be sort of enough to watch for, right? So the kind of language we use in exposition, perhaps, or just in moments of description of setting or of characterization or that sort of thing, could be enough, right? I mean, that might be akin to the music, right? Whatever we set for sort of the atmosphere, the mood, something like that would be enough to prime the reader in a way to kind of paint a worldview in a particular way. What would other tools be that we would have that would kind of, that would be perhaps again analogous to what we saw there?
I'm thinking about how we use the rhythms of language, and do that in a way that's unexpected rather than soothing.
Yes. One thing I noticed there, Sandy, is there were some cuts, right? Some editing cuts, and I think that could be, you know, similar to kind of what you're talking about, in terms of, you know, sentence structure, or you know subordinate clauses, or you know, the way we cut paragraphs or cut from a scene to another. You know, even some of those things could keep our reader off balance in a particular way, that again doesn't allow them to get comfortable, maybe.
Yeah, I was thinking like abruptness.
Mm-hmm.
Abruptness between conversations, or abruptness in the scene somehow.
Yeah. That's kind of akin to those like quick scene cuts away to another character, to another character, to another character. Right, that's surprising.
Right. Or maybe people don't finish their sentences.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, this was a switch. This wasn't in the original trailer, but I love that scene where she's in front of the mirror and then there's a different image in the mirror behind her. I mean, that's obviously, you know, a horror movie creepy thing. But, you know, if we think about, you know, forgive me, I don't speak French, so I always overpronounce my French, but the mise en scène, right, of a horror movie where there's just like sort of one weird object planted in a scene that's just a little bit out of place, you know? And how that, again, suggests sort of the oddity of it. I mean, a great example is in, you know, Psycho, when Marion and Bates are just having their lunch of sandwiches in the room behind the motel's check-in room. They're just having a lovely, you know, little meal of sandwiches, but randomly there's a whole bunch of taxidermy all over the walls. And then there are these reproduction paintings of like the rape of the Sabines, I'm saying that wrong as well, but on the scene behind it. And you don't necessarily notice unless you're looking really close, but it's weird that there are like reproductions of these rape scenes and then like all of this taxidermy on the wall, you know? Just planting like a weird little detail like that in a seemingly innocuous scene is enough to just, you know, the reader might not notice it at first read, but it can be striking. On this next scene or slide, I have, this is not a horror movie or not a horror or anything like that. I think it's a stunningly beautiful paragraph from Winter's Bone. I don't know if anyone knows this book, but Daniel Woodrell kind of wrote, there's a movie made from it, which is a pretty good movie too, but I have to say the book is just stunningly beautiful. And it's the first paragraph from that. And I think it's a really excellent example of setting tone early on. Ree Dolly stood at break of day on her cold front steps and smelled coming flurries and saw meat. Meat hung from trees across the creek. The carcasses hung pale of flesh with a fatty gleam from low limbs of saplings in the side yards. 3 halt, haggard houses formed a kneeling rank on the far creek side, and each had 2 or more skinned torsos dangling by rope from sagged limbs, venison left to weather for 2 nights and 3 days, so the early blossoming of decay might round the flavor, sweeten that meat to the bone. I think that is a stunning first paragraph. Woodrell kind of began the genre that we now call country noir. It's set in Appalachia. It's a stunningly beautiful book. And that is a hell of a first paragraph for setting the scene. That sweeten the meat to the bone. You know, they've just been hunting. But that is such an amazing setting of tone. Gorgeous detail. But you know something's going to happen. And it's going to be something hard. And, you know, the book does not disappoint. But I think that that's a great example of, you know, Sandy, as you were suggesting, the rhythm. 3 halt, haggard houses formed a kneeling rank on the far creek side. You know, look at that imagery, sweeten the meat to the bone, the early blossoming of decay. I mean, the beauty in that language. And also, you know, I'm going to guess that's not all that legal hunting. And that is such a stunningly beautiful paragraph. So, you know, I mean, whether we're talking about beginning a short story or, you know, doing some flash or, you know, some prose poetry, what can be accomplished that can, you know, just prime the reader to look for what's coming next. I think that's a really stunning example of what can be done. Everybody should read that book if they haven't read it. Again, the movie's good too, but I'm just saying there's a whole lot in the book that we missed. So moving on to the next thing. Tori, how are we doing on time? I'm sorry, I can't see.
It's 7:45.
Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about was the eye camera. And again, this is something stolen from horror theory or cinematography. So the eye camera is a really common thing used in horror film. And we've probably seen this a lot where there are these moments where somebody's looking through a camera and we don't know who. It often, in classic slasher movies, would happen early on, first third of the movie. We suspect it's the killer, but we don't know, and the killer's identity is obscured from us. On the right, you have the beginning of the shower scene. And I think that's actually probably from the remake from Psycho 2. I couldn't find a good one of Vivian Leigh. But again, at that point in Psycho, I hope I'm not spoiling it for anybody. We don't know that that the person who appears to be Mrs. Bates isn't Mrs. Bates. Again, I hope I'm not ruining that for anybody. The one on the bottom left is Friday the 13th. We're viewing in on the cabin. And again, we can't even clearly tell who the characters are at that point, but we know somebody's looking at somebody and it's not going to go well. And then I'm not sure where the upper left one is, but there the person is aware they're being viewed. And so the thing to think about with the eye camera is who's seeing, you know, the limiting of perspective. And we, the viewer, so if we're thinking about our writing, we, the reader, don't necessarily know who's doing the seeing, who's doing the writing, whose perspective and point of view we're in. And the limiting of that perspective can be really powerful because it helps to build suspense. And maybe we're let in at some point during the story. You can decide when. Maybe there's a little subterfuge where it seems like we're let in, but then there's a bait and switch. And that's usually, again, in the sort of classic slasher movies, how that would work. That we think the killer is so-and-so, but then later it's revealed that it's so-and-so, right? That's sort of the classic with Psycho. We think it's Mrs. Bates who did the killing, and then we find out there is no Mrs. Bates, right? It's Norman in Mrs. Bates's outfit. Or with Friday the 13th, right? We think it's, you know, one person and then it's another person. So that in that way, it's kind of a double disguise. Or, you know, I think it was parodied in Scream, right? That we think it's the killer, but then we find out something different. But the eye camera actually obscures, right, who the narrator is in our case, if we're thinking in terms of our writing. And so the way to think about that for us is who's our point of view, who's our perspective, and how do we want to limit that? So if we want to translate that, we can think about using more limited perspectives or point of views. Obscuring, you know, who's telling the story in a particular way to build that tension and build that suspense, and then potentially provide for a reveal later on, or not, or, you know, do those reveals in little piecemeal things, right? So that there isn't a full reveal, perhaps. There's other ways also to think about limiting the reader's access to information. And some of those might be those structural choices, right? To do sort of a cutaway, or to do a fragmented narrative, or to fragment the chronology, right? Things like that. To have some missing moments. So even if we do have a coherent, sort of fully omniscient narrator, maybe there are some moments that are missing or that occur sort of out of that chronology or out of that sort of organized frame of reference. So limiting perspective can also be something we could, you know, borrow from the conventions of film in a way to, again, unsettle the reader, to build that suspense, and to just sort of further limit the reader's access to information in a way that could be interesting.
I think in some horror poems, there's this unsettling merging of subject and object, and you're not sure who is doing what to whom, which is really creepy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and one of the prompts I have later talks about Schrodinger's U, as a perspective to potentially try, which kind of merges that if one's experimenting with second person point of view, that sort of slippage between who is that you talking to, right? Is that you a shield for an I, or is it speaking directly to the reader? Which I think Sandy also kind of gets at, that not having a stable or coherent, there's a slippage, right, between subject and object in a way.
The point of view doesn't stay firm.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, you know, is unsettling. And some people find it distracting, but others find it pleasurable. So the last one I have on here is thinking about exploiting our imagery as well. And since, you know, so many of us are poets, we traffic in imagery. So, you know, really thinking about, yeah, I think exploit is the right word. You know, if we think back to those theories of the uncanny, or that idea of categorical impurity, really being intentional in, you know, not only the kind of imagery we use, but where we want to place it, where we want it to recur, how we want to highlight it, to heighten that unease for the reader. Is, you know, that's one of our primary tools that we can use. So, you know, taking the everyday and making it strange or unsettling, giving particular moments to our characters to make them sort of caught outside of easy classifications. You know, they don't have to, I'm not suggesting they need to be undead monsters, but giving them something that makes them unclassifiable, you know, either to the reader or just to the other characters they interact with, so that they are within the realm of that universe, of that context, of that story we've created. Unknowable is something that we can definitely exploit.
Do you have characters that you've written, Christina, who are unknowable in some way? Do you have like examples?
Yeah, so I'm working on a short story right now where, I don't know, I was going for a walk in the woods, and you know how there's just weird junk in the woods? But they're baby shoes. Like I just kept noticing weird, like just baby shoes, you know, because there's just weird stuff in the woods. And so I'm working on this story right now where there's this woman, she's kind of modeled after my mother, don't tell her, who's like just started dating again, you know, but online dating's weird, right? Like you get to know people in different ways. And if you haven't dated for a long time and then you go back to that probably feels a bit fraught. And so she ends up going to this guy's house, and he, on his bookshelves, just has baby shoe after baby shoe after baby shoe after baby shoe lined up. And he ends up telling her like he's a forager and he goes for lots of walks in the woods. And he noticed, you know, that he just kept running across weird stuff. And after a while, he just decided to start collecting something, and it ended up being baby shoes. But if you go over to a guy's house, like after you've met in public a bunch of times, right? And it's like your sixth date, and he's decided to cook you dinner, and you notice that he's got a bunch of single baby shoes lined up on the bookshelves. That's kind of creepy, right?
Not kind of.
Right. So he has a perfectly good explanation. He's a very nice guy. He's made homemade pasta sauce. But, and he has a very good explanation. He's a forager. He's in the woods all the time. If it was playing cards he decided to start picking up, that wouldn't have been weird. But it's baby shoes.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's creepy.
Ooh.
There you go. But I don't actually, like, he's not a bad guy. Like, legitimately in the story, he's not a bad guy, but it's profoundly creepy. I really enjoy writing those kinds of stories. And
The serial killer is never a bad guy when anybody around him has been interviewed.
But this guy is, seriously, he's really not a bad guy. He just, you know, he's been in the woods for, you know, 20 some years and has happened to, you know, randomly decide that's the thing he's going to collect. But when you see it all, it comes across as creepy. But he's not a serial killer and he's not a bad guy. You know, he's got a whole backstory that explains it. Yeah. Whew. But that's what I mean, right? Like you can take a little detail and you can exploit it.
And how do you want your readers to feel about that character?
Well, so that's what this is my plan, is I'm going to have it from multiple perspectives, right? So you can be unsettled and then it can be explained, and, you know, in the end,
we mostly like them, but
yeah, I mean, you're going to be unsettled. My hope is that you're going to be unsettled, but eventually you're not going to be, or you're going to wonder, you know.
Okay, but could somebody else be killing children in the woods?
No, he's collected them over like 40 years of foraging in the woods. It's just a random collection.
Okay, but it becomes, one wouldn't be creepy, you know, a dozen is creepy.
Right, but over 40 years foraging in the woods, it's not, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. The other example was, I had put some on here from my story, but we don't have time for that, and that's fine. But again, I think that you can find anything and you can do anything you want to. I've got a story in my book where there's something wrong with this house, and the way they figure it out is just that they're in these woods and there's literally nothing in these woods. And actually the next page is more useful. There's not a single bug in the woods. Nothing can live by this house. Nothing can live within like a perimeter of 5 miles around this house. And, you know, they've rented this house in the woods, and they just keep noticing nobody gets a tick. There's never a mosquito. There's no fish in the lake, and it's just so weird. And they finally figure it out when somebody gets past the perimeter, and, you know, and there's ticks again, and there's, you know, bugs and that sort of thing. But again, you know, just planting seeds throughout the story that, you know, do you have any DEET? You know, there's no ticks. No one gets a mosquito bite. They're fishing in the lake. There's not a single bite. You know, it's just the weird thing that's out of place in context. And you just keep dropping little details here and there, and it builds up and builds up and builds up in the story until you find out there's something wrong with these woods, you know, and then you add in that you're creepy. But just, you know, using imagery and making that work is kind of the way that goes. Do you guys want to stop and before we do prompts and talk about, you know, other questions and things like that? About things you're working on?
Well, I'll share. I am working on a character who is cursed. And I've been trying to figure out how to convey his cursedness. And so if anybody has ideas on that, I will take them.
And are you wanting this to be a slow reveal throughout the story, like how he's cursed, or?
No, he's cursed from the beginning, or he believes he's cursed from the beginning. Other people don't realize it till later.
Do you mean cursed, damned, or cursed you could never find a true love, or, you know, what? What is the curse?
He keeps finding baby shoes.
Cursed in the sense that he's haunted from the past, and he will never have a life free of it.
Well, that's us all.
I know, but maybe amped up a little bit. Like just this idea.
particular event.
Just this idea of being cursed is interesting to me, and how to convey it. And
so are you wanting to figure out, Tori, how to include that without having it be like a big chunk of like backstory, like a big chunk where it's just, you want to
Right.
find a different way to work it in?
right.
I don't know.
What does it look like, I guess?
Does he tell people he's cursed? Because I knew a man that would say, my family has a curse on them. And he would tell everybody that, yep, there's a curse. So does your character tell people?
Yes,
Like,
he
I'm
tells
cursed.
people. Yes, he tells people he's cursed. Yes.
It doesn't sound like fun at parties. I would think about actions, you know, like if there are ways in which he feels that he can't participate in things or do things, or, you know, like is he walking somewhere and he turns around because he thinks he can't do that normal thing that other people do. You know, like the more you can show him stopping himself from participating in things, you know, so we can see the effects of it as opposed to
Straight telling.
Yeah.
It's so foreign, it seems to me, a character like that in our culture today, because there's so much emphasis on wellness and finding 5 positive things when you're walking in the woods, and doing your yoga in the morning, and playing the song to bring down your tension. It's such a foreign concept to me that there would be, I mean, we all have demons, but that this fellow would announce, I'm cursed, when there's so much talk about mental health and finding, and Nepo's book on the Book of Away, it's just such a foreign concept to me. What do the rest of you say?
Cursed implies that there's some kind of mythological intervention, like in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. They keep rolling snake eyes over and over again.
Flipping a coin.
Yeah, or flipping the coin. You know, okay, so the laws of probability break down. You know, in normal life, we have good things and bad things, but people who are cursed don't ever, you know, get their share of the good things, because, you know, if a bad thing can happen, it happens. And it, you know, it implies that, you know, God and Satan are, you know, are intervening, that there's some outside force.
Tori, I have a thought. And that is, sometimes a writer needs to get out of the way of ourselves. And so try using a different word in your own head. Because curse could be PTSD. Curse could be familial, you know, going back through generations. It could be a hex. I'm cheating because I'm looking at the thesaurus. Because I was thinking of, well, what is a, that's what everybody's saying. What is a curse, right? And so that was my first thought, is to get out of the way and use different language to yourself. And then secondly, to think about balancing, like Christina said, action dialogue, interactions with interior monologue. And that could be tricky, like how you balance that so that you get both perspectives. What does the guy look like? Is he bald? Oh, sorry. I just pulled that out of my Whoops. I mean, what ethnicity is he? Is he an immigrant? You know, all the experiences that shape us. Sometimes just by describing him, that's enough. That gives us a picture, right? Because we all make judgments on when we look at someone.
Is he mentally ill?
Right. Mm-hmm.
You could use
that. We all are. So, you know, that's a good thing.
Oh, Christina talked about repetition. You could use like something that keeps happening to him. You know, like the same thing keeps happening.
That proves something is bad. Yeah.
No, that's good.
Yeah, I think something like that would work better than, yeah, like I'm picturing like if a person keeps trying to show him kindness and then something interferes with the kindness, then in his head, it would start to reinforce, you know, that he's cursed or something like that.
Okay, good. All good. Thank you. Very, very good things for me to consider.
What's his name?
Colin.
Okay, so give him 10 different names and see if his name does something.
Okay. Thank you. That's awesome. If somebody else has a question, we can move on. Thank you for that, though. That was great.
All right, I'll share some prompts then. Maybe we can. Those will maybe get us thinking or help us think of other things. Oops. There we go. All right, so this one was sort of designed to get us thinking about doing something that would make sense in one context, but doesn't make sense in another context. That idea of creating the uncanny or the unsettling thing, but also making use of things that we know a lot about, right? So the first idea there is to take a specialized, so we all know about random weird things that we know a lot about. I was actually thinking of someone who I was hoping was going to be here tonight, but ended up not being able to come. But the first bit is to take a specialized process, hopefully something you know a lot about, and something that's highly technical, right? And describe that process in a very detailed way. And again, really exploit that imagery. But then take that process and put it in a context where it really doesn't belong. You could give it to a character who it doesn't make sense that the character would do it, or put it in a place where it really doesn't make sense. And so this sort of thing enables you to make use of your knowledge, right? Your very specialized knowledge. But then when you put it somewhere where it doesn't belong, it sort of immediately kind of upends the process and makes it weird, strange, unsettling because it doesn't belong here. And what I was thinking about was this writer I know who ended up writing about, so this might be creepy already. She ended up writing about the process of taxidermying bear hands. But it's so cool. Anyway, it was really detailed. It was incredibly detailed. But then she ended up sort of moving it into this place that made absolutely no sense. So it was super detailed, super specialized. And then because she put it in a place that it made no sense, all of these details became profoundly unsettling, and creepy. Like she gave it to, like, I think her grandmother or something like that. And it became really odd. We know about weird things. We know how to make jerky at home. We know how to, I don't know, change the fan belts on cars. We know how to do all sorts of things, that are like hours and hours alone, that are things we know how to do. Warp a loom, all of these things that we know how to do that are very particular, but then give them to somebody that it doesn't make sense that they know how to do it, or put it in a place that it doesn't make sense. And it becomes weird when you decontextualize and recontextualize it. And it's a way to make use of, whatever that really quirky thing you know how to do is, put it somewhere where it doesn't belong. Does anybody want to share anything really weird that they know how to do really well? I'm thinking of like,
well, I don't know how to do this really well, but I've witnessed other. I'm not very mechanically inclined or anything else, but I got a story where making potato chips, homemade potato chips.
I would like to know how to do that.
It's not hard. It's just I just looked online to remind myself all the details. My mother made them a long time ago, but then I flipped it I told it from the potato's perspective.
Okay.
So it gets kind of creepy. You're being baked in an oven and.
Sure. Well, and I'm trying to think like, I mean, I'm guessing that's like a pretty labor intensive process, right?
No, it's simple.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah,
Oh,
you wash the potato, cut it up, soak them, and then throw them in some olive oil and salt, toss them up and put them on a pan and fry them. Or cook them.
So I'm trying to think of like a character who, if they did that, like in a particular way or in a particular place,
right.
I don't know, it would be surprising or unsettling that they did that. You know, I'm thinking of like my college students trying to do it in their dorm room or something. Do you know what I mean? I'm like thinking of somebody that you would be like, well, that's weird. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's kind of the idea, is that when you put it in a different place, it gets odd that a person would know how to do that.
Yeah.
Or they wouldn't normally do it there or something like that.
A concentration camp.
Yeah, no. I don't think that would be, no.
Yeah.
But yeah, that basic idea of, you know, taking something that, and then again, I really explain the process and then put it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So that's one idea. This next one I thought is one that would work potentially for flash or for prose poetry. Make a list of items. Sorry, this was my shoe thing, my baby shoe thing, but put that out of your mind. And then once you have that list, imagine a character who collects the items and focus on the idiosyncratic items. You can then imagine an observer of these collections or of those collectors. You could invent backstories for those weird collections. For some reason I've started collecting paper mache puppets that I find at antique stores. Those are the things that my partner makes me keep in this room because he finds paper mache puppets from antique stores really weird. But I think they're creepy cool, but he thinks they're creepy weird. And then creating a museum catalog or archival document for the collection is the thing that I actually think would be kind of a cool prose poem. But could be unsettling and pretty creepy. So focusing on the idea of the collections of the arcane or the strange, and whatever backstories one wanted to write about either the collections or the collector, or the psychology of the collector of the paper mache puppets. If you wanted to imagine what got me started, I have no idea, but I rather enjoy them and they are kind of creepy. That was my second prompt idea. I might write that actually, or maybe he'll write it for me. And then my third prompt was the point of view prompt. And so this is connecting to that eye camera idea. So, you know, again, depending on the story, or if you've got one already that you're working on and you're thinking about how could I maybe kind of unsettle this further. I think playing with point of view is just really great fun. And I don't know, Tori, if I do have a link here, but if anyone's interested, there's a really, really great article on Waxwing magazine called A Taxonomy of the Second Person You. And that's what this link here is, where I've got Schrodinger's you. And it talks about the different kind of second person yous. So I find second person you really, really fun to work with. I think it's kind of unsettling if it's done in a particular way. And the one that they call Schrodinger's you is the one where there is this sort of slippage between, is that second person you a shield for the eye of the author, or is it speaking to the reader? And so the second person you that they call Schrodinger's you is the one where there's kind of slippage between those two. And it's kind of both and at the same time. And so that you that speaks directly to the reader, but may also be hiding the author's eye. I really love that one quite a bit. So playing with that second person you as just an unsettling you is one that I really enjoy as just kind of a fun way to unsettle things. I also think slipping into it in a more traditional perspective or point of view in a story to be really kind of interesting. That what I'm calling that person inclusive point of view, a communal narrator, is kind of the one I'm thinking about that was used in like Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, where the town was a narrator. The whole town kind of narrates the story as a we. Or kind of like if anyone's read The Virgin Suicides, I think it's Eugenides' first novel, where it's all the town's boys are narrating the story as if they're one. That's really creepy. It really can be done in such a way that it's like everyone's in on the story, telling it as a we. You know, that can be really interesting to play with and to try to tell a story as if we're all in it watching this together. I think that's really worth playing with. It can be really tricky as well, but I found that in The Virgin Suicides to be really kind of unsettling. A limited third-person narrator that again is only able to go into one character's sort of internal motivations, or one or two. If we're thinking of withholding information so the reader doesn't really know what's going on, that could be maybe a slightly more traditional way to play with that. Fragmenting your narrator or never revealing who your narrator is can also be, like the eye camera, we don't know who's behind that lens. Maybe it's never revealed, can be kind of interesting. And then maybe doing an intentionally unreliable narrator, or a narrator that draws attention to its unreliableness in sort of a meta kind of way, I think can also be really, really interesting. And the reason I suggest that, either revisit a story that you're already working on or retell a story that you know very well, maybe something you've already told, is just that so you can play with the narration, so that you can play with the perspective and point of view. So that's your primary focus, and kind of see where that leads you. So those are my ideas.
And we'll share the PowerPoint with everybody after the fact.
That sounds good. Do other thoughts or questions? Other things you all would like to talk about?
If you use the limited or the fragmented or the whatever it is, does the reader does it take a really highly sophisticated reader to read that short story or that novel or whatever? Otherwise, does the reader come away feeling unsatisfied or like what is it about it? I just couldn't get it. How does that work for the reader?
I think it's a matter of taste and aesthetic. I think some people love that sort of thing. Some people don't. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that.
Thanks.
Sorry, Janice, I personally really, really enjoy that kind of work, but some people really don't. And, some people might like it if then other parts of the story were more simplified, right? If there's only sort of one thing that we have to wrestle with, or if it, maybe if it's a shorter piece. Some people really, really love experimental fiction and some people don't,
Thanks.
I don't think there's any one answer. You're muted, Sandy.
You have to know well the structure and rules of fiction in order to break them. so the more slippage that you put into your writing, the more you're demanding of your audience, as she said. It's kind of like, you know, you become a writer's writer when you break so many rules. In many cases, that's fine, because many of us are jaded in what we read about, and so then the broken rules and the openness and whatever becomes really cool. But a lot of people don't like that.
I also think, though, you can learn a lot from doing it too. So, you know, I personally write to learn, you know, as well. You know, I mean, I don't just write I don't write and send everything out. I mean, I learn an awful lot from writing. And so I think that there's a value to trying things out, and I might in the end decide, okay, that's not for me, but that doesn't mean that I don't learn something from the doing of it. And I value that experience as well. So I think it's worth experimenting with different styles and different kinds of writing. And I might then decide, it's not for me, but that doesn't mean the experience isn't worthwhile, the learning and the experimenting as well.
Can you talk about the unreliable narrator?
So, I mean, any first-person narrator is unreliable, just by virtue of being first person, because we are all filtered through our own subjectivities. So that just, you know, anytime, so if I'm going to talk to Tori tomorrow and say, so here's how I thought today went, Tori's going to have a different experience of how today went, just because Tori is in her Toriness and Christina is in her Christina-ness, and Christina-ness is different than Toriness. So that's just the way that is. Whether how visible that is on the page can be exacerbated or lessened in particular ways, whether the narrator is aware of their unreliability or not, right, is a question. How much that affects the perceived objectivity or neutrality of that narrator is also varies.
Was it always first person, or does it show up in third person too?
No, you can see it there as well, right? Because other characters could be questioning or interacting or, you know, responding to it differently as well. But any first person narrator, just by virtue of being a first person narrator, is inherently unreliable. So you could play with that a little bit, right? Like you could draw attention to it in ways that could be kind of fun and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I like first person written stories, and I started writing mine that way, but it was like so limiting.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm going to try third, and I could it totally expanded. But maybe it's just really tricky to do.
Maybe you want to try second.
Second. I got to look that up.
I mean, second, I think again, some people really don't like it. Some people don't like reading it, but I think second has all the pleasures of first and third myself, because you can cheat at both.
I have to read about it. I mean, first is just natural because like you write poems in the I, you know, I mean, I do. Most of my poems are written in the I, you know, not necessarily being in a poem, but a lot of times you say I. So that was the natural way to start when I started it. And anyway, then I just tried something different. But
I find that interesting, Jeannie, because I find first person limiting, because I feel as if I can't describe things from the outside.
Yeah. Well, that's how it got to be in the story, you know, because it was like, well, how can they do this because they don't know that kind of thing.
They can't describe themselves. Like
I
did my hair differently that day because I was like, it's just,
you know,
I find it like a box, you know? But yeah, then take a section and rewrite it in second, and then compare your first to your third to your second. And I don't know, like see what the advantages and disadvantages of each are, and just like play around. I think that's great fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe look up that article on Waxwing, because it talks about like 7 different kinds of second person use.
Yeah.
Is anybody excited to write something creepy?
I like the prompts. I'm anxious to try the prompts.
Anybody want to send their mother on a date with somebody creepy? That's just what I do in my stories.
Yeah, the prompts gave me a number of ideas, so thanks, Heidi.
Oh, good.
Well, do you want to wrap us up maybe?
I don't know that I have much to say in wrap up, except thank you for coming on a Thursday night. And yeah, hopefully we'll get to see some of each other soon, except Kathy, you're in Vegas. Win big. Hope you
No, you don't gamble if you live in Las Vegas.
I really can't imagine doing that at all. That's kind of not my job. I should hope for rain for you. Is that
Today?
Oh, you got some today.
We had rain today, yes.
Good. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Christina.
Yeah, take care, everybody.
Thank you for Christina. And like I say, I'll share the recording and the PowerPoint after the fact, so you can kind of replay your favorite parts and take them into your writing practice.
And thanks, Tori, so much for setting this up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.